All right, today we're going to be looking at triangles that do not have a right angle in them. So we're going to call these the non-right triangles. And for non-right triangles, you can't just use SOHCAHTOA because that only works with right triangles. So therefore, we have to have a different way to figure out angles and sides on non-right. So one method we have is going to be called the law of sines. Okay, and then the next lesson will be on the law of cosines. But right now we're just going to focus on the law of sines. So if we look down here, law of sines, we have little letters on top and we have sign of capital letters on the bottom. Now, I know I have 3 fractions listed here, but you're only going to use 2 out of the 3, just depending on the information you know. So you may use the first 2, or you could use the last 2, or you could use the first and the last. You just got to make sure you always put the side value, which is the little letters, over sign of the capital letters, which is the angle value. Okay, so before we get into problems like you're going to see on your homework, let's say we've already got some that are set up here. We want to practice just how do I solve them once they're set up. And then we'll get to examples where we have to go through and set them up and solve them. So under number 1 here, the pre-work, on the first one, we have 10 over the sine of 50 equals b over the sine of 36. And if you remember earlier in the year when we talked about if you had 2 fractions, then you would start by cross multiplying. So I'm going to cross multiply. So I'm going to have 10 sine of 36 equals, and then cross multiply the other direction, and I would have b sine of 50. And then if I want to get b by itself, how do I get rid of the sine of 50? Well, hopefully everybody says, ooh, I would divide. So, moral of the story, you will always divide by whatever is across from the letter. So I could just set this problem up. Now that I know that, I could just look at this and say, oh, okay, I'm going to take 10 times the sine of 36, and I'm automatically going to divide that by the sine of 50 because that is across from my letter B. So right now, just type this into your calculator. Let's make sure we close our parentheses here when our calculator opens the parentheses. So 10 sine button 36, close my parentheses, divided by sine of 50, close my parentheses. And if I round to the tenths, I get b to equal 7.7. Okay, now on the next one, we're still going to cross multiply, but you're going to notice this time the variable is not a side. The variable is an angle. Okay. So I'm going to take 32 sine of 50 equals 40 sine of B. And then I want to get rid of the 40, so I'm going to divide it away. Boom. But now remember, this is what the sine of big B would equal. So if I'm going to figure out an angle, I have to remember to use the inverse. So I would start with the inverse of sine, open my parentheses, and then type in 32 sine 50. Make sure you close your parentheses around that. And then divided by 40, and then close your parentheses for the inverse. So if you type it in exactly like that, then I get angle B to be about 37.8. So remember, when you're setting these fractions up and we cross, multiply, and divide, if you're trying to find an angle, you must hit the inverse at the beginning. Okay, so moving on to example number 2 and example number 3. These will look more of what your homework is going to look like. Just like before, I'm going to give you 3 pieces of information, and you need to find the other 3. So I got E is 29 degrees. So over here by capital E, I got 29 degrees. Capital F is 112 degrees. And I know little d is 22 degrees. So now when I just have a random triangle drawn here, remember, don't draw a right triangle because there are no right angles. We get to label the triangle however we want. So I'm just going to choose to go E, and then F, and then D at the top. So little e is across from big E, little d is across from big D, and little f is across from big F. Okay, now on my triangle, I'm going to mark in what I know. I know E is 29 degrees. Boom. I know F is 112 degrees. Boom. And I know little d is 22. Okay, if you know 2 angles, then the easy one to start with is the third angle, because all angles in a triangle add up to 180. So I would start by doing 180 minus 29 minus 112. So therefore, the measure of angle D would be 39 degrees. So that's one of my 3 answers. Check. Now, I need to set up the law of sines to find the side values. So to find the side values, you got to start with a fraction where you know both the little letter and the big letter. Okay? And in our case, that is the d's. So I'm going to put little d, which is 22, over the sine of big D, which is 39. So one fraction, you must know the little letter and the big letter. Boom, check, equals. Now we get to decide, do we want to find little e or do we want to find little f? Doesn't matter which one we pick first, so I'm just going to go with little e. So for little e, I would set it up as little e over sine of big E, and big E is 29 degrees. So now cross multiply and divide by what's across from E. So I would set it up as 22 sine of 29. And then I'm going to divide that by sine of 39. Remember, we're not trying to find an angle. Since we're not trying to find an angle, there's no reason to hit inverse. So no inverse. So type that in exactly like that on your calculator. And I get little e to round to 16.9. Okay, now I want to make sure everybody remembers this. Pythagorean theorem is only good with right triangles. We do not have right triangles, so therefore we are not allowed to use that in this problem. So what we have to do is we have to set up the law of sines again. So once again, I'm going to go back to the one I knew both, which was D. So 22 over sine of 39 equals, this time let's go with little f. So I have little f over sine of big F, which is 112. Let me erase my little f. That doesn't look very good. Sorry about that. See if this looks a little bit better. There we go. All right. Cross multiply. And remember to divide by what's across from your variable. So 22 sine of 112. And then we're going to divide by sine of 39. And remember, no inverse because we're trying to find a side, not an angle. So if you type that in, I get F to equal 32.4. So 32.4. Right. So one type of problem you have is where you are given two angles and one side. So that was my example of two angles and one side. Now my last example here, my given information is one angle, so 97.5 for T, and two sides. So remember, across from big T is little t, so little t is 80. And across from big R is little r, so little r is 75. And little s is across from big S. So in this problem, we know two sides and one angle. Okay, so this time we have to start with the law of sines. I can't do 180 minus because I don't know two angles. So let's start with the law of sines. Which one do I know both the big and the little letter? Well, that is T. So little t, which is 80, over sine of big T, which is 97.5, equals. Now, I have to choose R. I can't choose S because I don't know either one of the S's, and I can't have two unknowns. So I have to find big R first. So little r is 75 over the sine of big R. Now this time we are solving for an angle. So if we're solving for an angle, I have to start with the inverse. So I'm going to do sine to the negative first on my calculator. Start with that. Cross multiply where you know both. So that would be 75 sine of 97.5 divided by what's across from sine R. That is 80. Oh, sorry about the page there. And then close my parentheses from the beginning because of the inverse. So remember, the sign in front of the R, that goes away because we put the inverse symbol out at the very beginning. Okay. So if I type that into my calculator, then I get angle R to equal 68.4 degrees. So now I'm going to come over here and put in 68.4 degrees. Okay, now I can find the other angle because if I know two angles, I can do 180 minus. So now I would start with 180 minus 97.5 minus 68.4. So that means angle S is 14.1. So now I got my third angle, 14.1 degrees. And the next thing I have to do to finish it up is to find little s. So remember, no Pythagorean theorem because this is not a right triangle. So therefore, I'm going to go back to the law of sines. So the one I knew both, 80 over sine of 97.5 equals little s over sine of big S, which is 14.1. Okay, we're trying to find a side, so no inverse. So cross multiply where you know both. So 80 sine of 14.1. And then divide that by what's across from little s, sine of 97.5. And if I type that into my calculator, I get little s to be 19.7. And that is it.